Welcome to our session on modeling and simulation, and I want to welcome and actually invite your class to participate at the end of our presentation by asking any questions you might want to based on the information on modeling and simulation I'm going to be presenting. I'm Hank Okraski. I'm with the National Center for Simulation. I'm one of the actual founders of the National Center for Simulation, and I've been doing this for a very, very long time. How long, I won't say. And I understand your students have not had lunch yet, so I'm probably the only thing standing between now and them having lunch. So I'll try to make it as interesting and as entertaining as I possibly can. I'm going to be talking about the wonderful world of simulation. And simulation may not be understood by everyone. Of course, you've heard of flight simulators. You've probably seen them in action even with military practices, their missions, and the commercial airlines use flight simulators. And perhaps most recently you saw the landing on the Hudson River, where Scully, the pilot, was so skillfully able to land the airplane on the Hudson River. And then we were able to review it through the miracle, if you will, of modeling and simulation, to actually replay it in real time and see what was facing the individual. Simulation, you might say, anything that's not real can be termed simulation. You know, a statue in a park is a simulator, if you will. A drawing can be a simulation. They're all abstracts. But we're going to be talking today mostly about physics-based simulations. And that is where a math model is developed. That's why it's so important to understand math and science. And then we, through computer, exercise the model and get some visual displays or some other outputs of what the simulation really calls for. And you can see from the first slide some examples. We have the military, we have the commercial airline world. We have a firefighting trainer that we simulate fires in different locations and people running to get to the fire. We could have never put a person on the moon if we didn't have some type of simulation for our astronauts to practice. We have simulators for teaching teachers, if you will, where we simulate an actual classroom with different types of students. Marine simulators and some virtual reality things. And I'm going to go back, if you will, in history, tell you how simulation really grew from its very beginnings in modern times, and then take you on up to today. And I think you'll find that quite interesting. Now, I can go back to World War II, but I can't go back to World War I. And this is a very primitive simulation. It's actually a gunnery trainer that a Russian pilot, Gilsher, constructed on his own. And you can see he sits on a platform that moves in a motion of 2 or 3 degrees of freedom. And on top are actually his weapons, some guns. And so he's practicing aligning the aircraft with his targets using this very, very primitive simulation. Again, in World War I, a German pilot, Karl Fink, came up with a very interesting simulation. This is actually the fuselage of an aircraft. And there's a back seat where an observer would sit, and in the front seat where the pilot is. Well, it just so happens that when they were running their missions, when they did some violent moves with the airplane, the gentleman in the back seat might go flying out. Now that could ruin the whole day. So what they did is they put together and made a simulation. They took the fuselage and they mounted it on a large, large wheel that you can see here. And the individual would get in the rear seat, and then the pilot in the front, and then someone would rotate this wheel, and the cockpit was pinned on the back, so the entire thing would roll over, and that way the crew would be able to practice what might happen, experience what might happen in the real world when they're in combat. The French, not to be outdone, they came up with their own simulator called the Antoinette. Now you can see there's a barrel, it's sitting on a platform, and you have that's not me there, it's somebody who looks like me. Anyway, they were able to move this barrel in bank and in roll, and so that the person here who is a wannabe pilot can experience what it might be in flight. Now we've come a long way. We had years and years ago, in fact they still have in the merry-go-rounds, little horses that people ride. Kids think that they're maybe riding a real horse, but a modern day simulator looks something like this. We have a rider, we have a simulated horse, we have a screen, and the individual rider then can practice riding by giving commands to the horse, and the horse behaves accordingly, the simulated horse that is. This is the horse that doesn't eat hay, is able to, the individual is able to get instructions then from the built-in instructional features of this. This whole thing is called a dressage. It's an expensive program to get into, and I'm not very, very familiar with it. But the earliest of flight simulators, modern day, is really the Link Trainer, invented by Ed Link. And you can see this is the blue box, as they called it. It had a rudder on it, it had wings, which really didn't serve any purpose, but it kind of made the pilot feel like they were getting into some kind of an airplane. A hood would come down, and they could practice instrument flying without leaving the ground. And this would move in 3 degrees of freedom, X, Y, and Z, for those of you who are mathematically inclined. And they could experience flight. They would have a radio control telling them what to do, essentially. And they could communicate with a simulated radio station. Now, during World War II, all the men, essentially, that could fly were off to war. And so what the United States Navy did was to go to the colleges and universities, and they hired and recruited essentially women who were involved in communication programs or public relations, who had good interpersonal skills, to be the instructors. Now, this photograph is taken up at Atlanta, Georgia, where the first wave, if you will, of female instructor operators came, and you can see all the trainers, all the simulators lined up, and they were there being used to teach the pilots. And here's one of the operators. She's talking to the simulated airplane pilot through a radio, and she's also watching where the individual is flying his airplane. The stylus here moved on a map according to what the position of the simulated aircraft was. Now I have a little video here that'll give you a little bit more on the history of simulation.
Simulators date back to the 30s when they began as a novelty, a cheap way to learn how to fly. Today they seem to be turning up everywhere, from the most cutting-edge military hardware to the latest attraction at the local arcade. The history of this remarkable device dates back to the early days of flight itself. During the First World War, both the French and British came up with several curious devices to train pilots, including the wingless penguin that taxied but never took off, and a half-barrel with wings called the Antoinette. The Ruggles Orientator was used by the French for testing prospective pilots for the right stuff. In the U.S., not even these devices were available. Lessons in a real plane cost $50 an hour for what was often no more than a harrowing joyride. A young pilot from Binghamton, New York decided there had to be a better way. His name was Ed Link.
Ed was a pilot, a barnstormer, back in the days when people wing walked. His father was an inventor and producer of theater organs. And these were the big organs that were used in silent movie theaters. And Ed found himself with a lot of inventory of old bellows and electromechanical devices from his father, and actually used a lot of that technology to put together his first trainer.
In 1929, Link patented his first pilot trainer. It was a mock cockpit mounted on top of 4 bellows that expanded and contracted to provide motion. It could bank, tilt, even spin around, just like a real airplane. But to Link's dismay, the only buyers were amusement parks, where his pilot trainer became just another novelty ride. Determined, Link set up his own flight school. For a flat fee of $85, he'd teach you how to fly. Unfortunately, the Great Depression was in full swing, and even the low price of $85 was a lot of money. In 1934, an antitrust decision forced commercial airplane makers out of the airmail business, and the job of flying the mail was handed over to the Army Air Corps. In their first few days of operation, 5 planes crashed. Suddenly, there was an urgent need to teach experienced pilots how to fly by instruments. and Ed Link seized the opportunity. He installed a compass and a turn and bank indicator into his pilot trainers, whose motion caused them to respond just as they would in actual flight. For extra measure, he added a hood, so the pilot would be forced to fly blind. The Army was interested. By the end of 1934, the first commercially successful flight simulator went into production at Link's small plant in Binghamton, New York.
Now, with the Link trainers, we trained some 500,000 pilots in World War II. And without the Link trainer, we probably would not have been as successful as we were. Now, there were some friends of Ed Link, too, that you may recognize. One in particular is Amelia Earhart. If you've seen the movie Amelia, you can have an appreciation for the importance of instrument flying. And in fact, this year, I think, represents the anniversary of her being lost over in the Pacific. And here's a picture of Amelia actually in the Link trainer. This is an interesting simulation. It's not really flight training or anything, but during World War II, we were quite concerned about the enemy bombing us, both on the east and west coast. Burbank was the home of Lockheed at the time, and they were manufacturing airplanes. Well, they didn't want their plant to get bombed necessarily, so what they did is they covered the entire plant with camouflage, such that it looked like farmland and open country, so that if a pilot then an enemy pilot were flying over, they say, well, there's nothing there, we'll just go on. However, when you look underneath the camouflage, you'll see that there were actually cars and work people and all, and business went on as usual underneath the camouflage. We're all into video games today. In fact, the military is using video games, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, but this is the inventor of the video game, Ralph Baer, back in 1951. And look at the complex equipment that he had to be able to play his video game in those days compared to what you have probably in your pocket right now, if you're allowed to have them in your pocket right now, well, at least at home or wherever. We used model boards in the early days to simulate flying over landmass. In other words, that board there is made up of all little houses and rivers and factories and whatever. And a camera, a TV camera, moved over the model board, as you can see with the gantry here. And so that information then was piped into a cockpit of a simulator to where the person could look out at the visual display and actually see what was down below. And as I said earlier, we couldn't have gone to space without a simulation of many, many kinds. And this is a mission simulator. And you can see Mr. Armstrong here, one of our astronauts, is practicing going to the moon. And if you saw Apollo 13, you'll know who the hero of the movie was. No, it wasn't who it was. It was the simulator. Remember, they had to go to the simulation to determine how they would load their electrical systems so that they could make it back to Earth. And without the simulator, I'm afraid we would have had different results. And here again, you see the astronauts practicing on a make-believe moon surface, if you will, using different kinds of simulation, more real-time, not real-time, but not virtual, but more live simulation. And over at Cape Kennedy, at the Kennedy Space Center now, they've recreated, or they've relocated essentially to Atlantis, and they have a number of simulators that are being used there for visitors coming in to be able to see what the astronauts really had to do. This just happens to be one of my grandsons as we went out there on our last visit. The military uses simulators in just about every warfare area imaginable. Here you can see the cockpit of a simulator. It looks just like the real thing. It behaves like the real thing. The view out the window is realistic, and it all operates in real time. And if you recall, maybe you don't know, but Jessica Lynch, who was involved in one of our wars overseas, if you will, was in a Humvee, and she and others practice in a Humvee simulator. You can see out the window here that there are simulated assets, like simulated tracked vehicles and dismounted infantry and even helicopters. They all participate in this overall scene of in the war scenario. This is a boom operator trainer. It's all simulated. It's to teach the boom operators how to insert that probe into a receiving airplane. So the men and women who operate the boom have to practice over and over again in getting that probe inserted properly into the receiving aircraft so that they have enough fuel to continue on with their mission. So practicing here in a simulator, it's safe, it saves money, and eventually it saves lives. Again, more military simulation. One of the most difficult scenarios to simulate is what we call nap of the earth, and that is flying very low over the treetops and buildings, because you can imagine how fast that simulation has to operate to be able to simulate this in real time, such that when the pilot looks out the window and he or she sees the airfield, it's all in real time. There's no blur, there's no distortion. Otherwise, it lacks a lot of its realism and appeal to the pilots. Whereas today, the simulation is almost better than the real world. Using computer-generated imagery, we're able to put together target aircraft. We can fly in formation, practice team operations, if you will, using modeling and simulation technology. The ultimate of what we do is in networked simulators, where we take simulators, we have 4 of them here that we tie together, and they fly a mission just like they do actually in the real world. The Air Force operates in what we call a 4-ship configuration, 4 airplanes at a time. So we're able to simulate that situation, that condition, in the simulators, so they can practice as a team. We seem to have whipped the individual team training, and now we're moving into the team training arena. We have a little bit more on the military.
Until recently, learning how to fire a rifle involved firing a rifle. In the 1970s, it occurred to Navy research engineer Al Marshall that there must be a better way. Marshall took a combat rifle and attached a laser transmitter to it.
It also had a receiver on it. The laser energy emitted from the rifle would reflect off of that retroreflective material, and the weapon itself would detect that returning laser beam, and the information would be encoded whether or not you had hit the target.
Marshall realized that he could attach the receiver to other people, creating what became known as Miles gear, the world's first laser tag. In the early 90s, the Navy began developing a headset-based simulator they called VSUB.
We were trying to develop a virtual world that would make the trainee feel that he was really on a real submarine.
With VSUB, even the other members of the crew are simulated.
Recommend continuing right to course 155.
Helm bridge, continue right, steady course 155.
We used what's called a speaker-independent voice recognition system. When the trainee wished to ask a question of the navigator, a simulated navigator would come on and give him the answer to his position or the distance to a turn or any other normal question that he would ask of a live navigator. Trainee can do everything that he could do in a Trident submarine, but it could do it safely.
Another system called VWETS incorporated a simulated patrol boat that moved.
When we developed that last trainer, we had no idea that the terrorism threat was going to be as severe as it is. So fortunately, we have those simulations now where we can practice against those kind of adversaries. Now, simulators are also used in many, many other applications. Here's a nuclear power plant simulator, which looks just like the real nuclear power plant. The beauty of these simulations is that you can practice the low probability but high impact events. In other words, you wouldn't want to try to create a meltdown situation in a nuclear power plant just to see if you could correct the issue. So they practice in the simulators. Also, we use simulation in traffic management and transportation planning. We can simulate roads and highways, and we can see what happens if we add more lanes to a highway, or we take away a couple of toll booths on the expressways. using simulation gives us a powerful tool for analysis. A gentleman up at Clarkson University has simulated an oil spill. And you can see that through visualization, they're able to predict, and again, using a very accurate math model, predict where the oil might be such that the first responders can get there and do their thing before it becomes a catastrophe. This is very apropos today because today is the anniversary of 9/11. It was 12 years ago when this took place. A gentleman, Dr. Hoffman at Purdue University, used finite element analysis to model the 9/11 situation. This is not just an animation. This is an actual simulation using a mathematical model. And this is one of the aircraft going into the World Trade Center, and this is it after it had penetrated. And again, what he's done here is he's studied the architecture of the building such that if we build new buildings, we'll know how to minimize the damage, the fire that spread and engulfed throughout the building, and take measures ahead of time, preventive measures essentially, to be able to deal with. Hopefully we won't have the situation occur, but if it should, we'll be in a better position to deal with it. I mentioned video games before. We're using now in the military off-the-shelf video games that you can buy over the counter. The virtual battle station, for example, is one of them, to where the military has taken them and are using them to create strategy scenarios, if you will, and tactics scenarios to practice using off-the-shelf commercial products. The first spin-off of our simulations from the military actually went to the commercial airlines. This is a simulator here, and you can see this is the cockpit, this is the visual display. These pistons actually give the motion to the cockpit. And I have a short video on that.
Here at the United Airlines Flight Center in Denver, Colorado, 36 Mammoth simulators provide a flying experience so incredibly realistic, it's easy to forget you're still on the ground.
Wind shear, wind shear, wind shear. Landing gear down here to the brakes are flaps to the brakes are on.
Let's take the flaps to 20.
124 knots, 2,000 down, 1,000 feet.
It is very, very much like flying an airplane. I'd say on a scale of 100, about 99.9. It's amazing how good they are. We can do things in the simulator that we'd never do in an airplane. We don't like how it occurred. We simply put the simulator back at the end of the runway and do it again.
Today, most airline pilots do all their training and certification on a simulator.
And we can train crews now from their first day on the airplane through their final licensing and certification, such that their first flight is a revenue flight.
Did you hear what the pilot said? That at times, the first flight for that pilot will be a revenue-producing flight. In other words, he hasn't flown that airplane before. He is transitioning from an earlier model to a later model without having to take test hops in a real airplane. They save money, and again, it's a testament to the fidelity of the simulation, that it is so accurate, again, through math modeling and using physics-based models. One of the most enjoyable projects I had was dealing with deaf and hearing impaired children at a local elementary school. We found that the kids spent most of their time in class learning living skills, and the teachers didn't have time to get into math or reading, if you will. So we created a virtual environment to where they could practice crossing the street or exiting a building in case there was a fire, how to dial 911, danger stranger. We created a situation where an individual came on the schoolyard and they were taught to avoid that individual and report it to the teacher, all using simulation in a virtual world. At the University of Central Florida, they created something called Teach Live, and this is for teachers, sort of wannabe teachers. In the undergraduate program, they're able to simulate a classroom where these students can raise their hand, they can ask questions, and you have a wide variety of behaviors here. You have the individual who maybe want to sleep through class, and I know that Mr. Keefe doesn't have any of those in his class. Laughter, okay. And then you have the nerdy kid, if you will, that's always asking questions, et cetera, et cetera. So they're able to simulate those in a classroom, and the teacher can practice dealing with a wide variety of behaviors in a classroom. This is a children's museum out in Denver, Colorado, where we simulate a fire station. Those happen to be my grandkids also. They work very cheaply. And here in Central Florida, medical simulation is growing in great abounds through the Lake Nona medical complex that's being developed there with the Veterans Administration Hospital, University of Florida, University of Central Florida, et cetera. They're all being located in essentially one location. And they have simulation laboratories using the human patient simulator. It breathes, it has blood pressure, and it reacts to drugs just like a real person would. And here you see the team getting ready to work on something that's been put into the human patient simulator, some illness or some operation or whatever, and they're practicing, again, saving lives. This is a Da Vinci surgical system. It's really a robotic simulation where the operator is in one room and the surgeon is another room and the patient is laid out here, and all the surgery is done using this remote system, if you will, that requires a lot of hand-eye coordination, you can imagine, to perform surgery on the individual here. And then we have entertainment. You know, we're real close here to the Center of Entertainment, particularly with all the theme parks that we have. But simulation for entertainment is a little bit different than simulation for defense or homeland security. And I have a video that shows
This isn't a roller coaster. It's a simulator. In the mid-'80s, simulators began to be used for an entirely new purpose: entertainment. The world's first virtual ride, Tour of the Universe, opened in Toronto in 1984, built out of a modified 747 aircraft simulator. Within a few years, smaller versions began popping up everywhere, giving audiences a chance to experience the thrill of both the chillingly real and the utterly fantastic. Universal Studios' Back to the Future ride took things one step further, projecting visuals on an enormous dome that put people literally inside the experience. Simulators have also returned to arcades, moving beyond early thumb twitch games to incorporate real-life replicas of motorcycles, snowboards, even whitewater rapids. But are they really simulators? Maybe, maybe not. They were never designed to train people to do anything, because the world they simulate isn't reality, but reality in overdrive.
I understand you lost some of your video for a portion of the broadcast, so we'll see how that works out when we get near the end. But in the world of entertainment, the customer is looking for something totally different there than they are, say, in a military situation. They're looking for a thrill ride. So the simulation accuracy doesn't have to be quite as good. And that's one reason they limit the time, too, that you spend in a simulator in the theme parks, because we have something called simulator sickness, and if the body cues do not agree with what you see or hear, it tends to make you a little ill. So obviously the theme park, the folks there don't really want to spend their time cleaning up after every exercise. So they limit the time in the entertainment world. I should point out that there are many, many centers across the United States that are involved in modeling and simulation. We have them out on the West Coast, on the East Coast, but the center of all of the activity, if you will, particularly for the military, is here in Central Florida, or across Florida for that matter. And you can see here that we have in Central Florida about 27,000 folks employed in modeling and simulation. And the average salary is almost close to $70,000 a year. So if you're looking for a career that pays well, and it's really, really exciting, you might consider modeling and simulation. And there are a number of companies up here in the Jacksonville area that deal in modeling and simulation. And you can see along the East Coast and all through the I-4 corridor, we have modeling and simulation enterprises. And they do a tremendous job, particularly with the military. And the military has what we call Team Orlando here in Central Florida. And Team Orlando is made up of the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Air Force, the Coast Guard, and many, many other activities related to modeling and simulation. It's a very, very powerful centroid, if you will, of modeling and simulation. And we learn from each other. The Navy learns from the Army learns from the Navy, the Marine Corps takes advantage of everybody's products because they have a low budget. And together we have what we call Team Orlando. And this is an aerial view of the Central Florida Research Park, our defense cluster. All these, we call them alphabet soups. They all mean something, all these short abbreviated names for the Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, etc., all located adjacent to the University of Central Florida. And this is our pipeline model, if you will. This is our simulation industry that is made up of those industries that I mentioned throughout the presentation of defense, healthcare, entertainment, and transportation. And we have our feeder network, the middle schools, like those in Jacksonville, for example, that feed our high schools. And we at the National Center for Simulation are going to be developing a certification program for high school students, much like Microsoft or some of the others, that'll enable high school students to have some part-time work in our industry. Then one can go on into the state colleges, the state universities. UCF offers a master's and doctorate degree in modeling and simulation. And so the engineers and scientists, the technicians, and our apprentices all will work together in the simulation industry. And really, the onus and the responsibility, in my opinion, lies to a large degree on our teachers. The long pole in the tent is our teacher base. We want to get as many up to speed in STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, such that students will find modeling and simulation and other engineering programs attractive careers for them in the future. And I have one short video that I'd like to show that all of our students love to see this because it's something that can be done with modeling and simulation in the entertainment world, something you see probably every weekend. Maestro?
Another season is upon us. Freshmen arrive wide-eyed with dreams of future glory, while seniors prepare for their last chance at immortality. There are only a handful of these opportunities in a man's life, a handful of chances to distinguish yourself from the rest. It's on these fields where history is made, where legends begin and heroes triumph. Traditions tell the story of what you represent, of those that forge the legacy you uphold. When you come charging out of the tunnel, 100,000 people will be watching your every move. How you respond to that pressure is what defines you. These are the moments that reveal your toughness, your determination, and your pride. The Roughnecks on the Sooner Schooner. Ralphie charging out of the gate. And Chief Osceola planting his spear. The time has come. Your time is now.
I hope you enjoyed that video. It's something EA Sports let us use for this presentation. That's about a year old. They're working on some new ones right now. But keep in mind, that's all animation. That's all computer-generated imagery that you saw there, and operating in real time in a very, very high fidelity. Now I think we're about ready for questions from Mr. Keefe's class up there in Jacksonville. Do we have any questions? That's a good question. Do you think simulators in some way have underdeveloped trainees because of lack of real-world experience? No, really. Simulators are complements to an overall training program, and they're woven into the curriculum at just the proper time to be effective in the transfer of learning. There is no substitute totally for live training, but there may be situations like space exploration where you can't go to space to practice going to space. You have to practice in the simulators. And we find that there's a high degree of transfer of learning or transfer of training from the simulation to the real world. But your point is well taken, that simulations alone are not the answer. It has to be coupled with, with classroom work for that matter, part task trainers, and then some real world experience. So it's a good question. Is there much cooperation between novelty, simulation, development, and industrial? For example, is the industry ever approached by Disney Scientific Development Department? There's more of that today than there has been in the past. One of the issues that both communities had to deal with was that it had to do with public relations. When you come to Florida, you're really coming to a place where people want to escape their everyday lives and they're working and whatever, and they want to relax. And the attractions, up until recently, were a little reticent on working with the folks that were involved in the defense business, because they couldn't see, having a good time with maybe preparing for a battlefield situation. So there wasn't much dialogue between the two communities. However, that has changed, and now we do have people from the entertainment world with the National Center for Simulation. We're going to be putting on the Lou Frey Institute Symposium on the 30th of September, and that will involve the people from defense and also from the entertainment industry. So there's more of that than has occurred in the past. I should also point out that our contractors, the people that build these simulators, the ones that do the military-like motion platforms, also do the entertainment motion platforms. So we see the two communities coming together much more closely, particularly here in Central Florida. What are the types of simulations we'll see at the symposium? Oh, they're going to have a number of things there that you're really going to like. Lockheed Martin will have some of their simulations there. Of course, they deal a lot in flight simulations, and the medical community will be there. They'll be demonstrating some of the medical simulations. We'll have part task training devices and almost full-up type simulations. There'll be some emergency response, I believe, simulations that'll be there. Just about every corner of our building will have some form of simulations, and you'll find it very, very exciting, very informative. I promise you that. Yes, I will be there. And I'd like to say hello to each and every one of you. Actually, I will be moderating the second panel that deals with the workforce development issue that we have in modeling and simulation. So I will be there. Hopefully I'll be wearing a different suit. Let's see. Are all the simulations electronic or mechanical? No. In fact, some of the medical simulations that we have that are very, very valuable to our medics just involve recreating wounds, like battlefield wounds. And some of those are really gross to look at. Like we can simulate a sucking chest wound, for that matter, occurring in battle, or things like a limb being wounded to where the blood and everything is there. And those are not really mechanical or electronic, they're physical. By and large, most are electronic because the math model has to be executed somehow, and we do that through the computer, so they become electronic. But there is room for other types of training devices, particularly as I mentioned, in the medical area. Well, again, in behalf of the Lou Frey Institute, I want to thank you for taking the time and listening to a little bit about the wonderful world of simulation. And I hope you all consider a career. You don't have to be an engineer or a scientist, for that matter. We contract negotiators, artists, architects, audiovisual folks, you name it, are all needed in our business.